Hey guys, and welcome back to Night Owl Historian, where the lights are dim, the tea is steeped, and the drama is royal. Tonight, we begin our journey into the Tudor dynasty, a period soaked in ambition, blood, whispered prayers, and the metallic clink of a blade hidden beneath velvet robes. Before you tuck yourself in with a warm blanket and a chilled sense of existential dread, make sure to like and subscribe if you enjoy these deep dives into the past, and let me know in the comments what time is it for you, and what's your favorite Tudor scandal? Because there are plenty. Now, dim the lights, silence the modern world. The Wars of the Roses have ravaged England for over 3 decades. A civil war that wasn't just about roses, but about power, inheritance, and who had the sharpest sword or the cleverest mother. On the mist-laced morning of August 22nd, at a place called Bosworth Field, 2 rival houses faced off. One, the House of York, led by the infamous Richard III, hunchbacked in legend, ruthless in truth. The other, a relatively unknown exile with a shaky claim to the throne, Henry Tudor. Now Henry was no warrior king by training. He'd spent much of his youth in Brittany, exiled, dodging assassins and surviving on the diplomatic edge of a knife. But he had 2 things, a noble bloodline, albeit through the illegitimate Beaufort line, and a very determined mother, Lady Margaret Beaufort. Never underestimate a Tudor matriarch, especially one who believes her son is destined to wear a crown. Henry's forces met Richard's on a field soaked with dew and fate. Richard, outnumbered but not outmatched, charged personally toward Henry with a sword in hand, a bold move even by medieval standards. And then betrayal. Key nobles in Richard's army switched sides. The tide turned. Richard was unhorsed, surrounded, slain. He was the last English king to die in battle. His crown, quite literally, was found in a hawthorn bush and placed on Henry's head. A new dynasty was born. If Henry VII were a flavor of tea, he'd be bitter, dark, and slightly herbal, the kind that leaves a dry aftertaste and a suspicious feeling you're being watched. Having won the crown not by inheritance but by victory on the battlefield, Henry knew every day on the throne could be his last. The Tudors were new, unproven, and surrounded by enemies with better bloodlines and worse tempers. So Henry did what all great chess masters do. He planned, hoarded, and moved only when he was sure of a win. He married Elizabeth of York, uniting the feuding houses of Lancaster and York, in a gesture that made poets swoon and rebels scowl. It was brilliant politics, cementing legitimacy and silencing, at least temporarily, those who called him an upstart. But paranoia ran thicker than royal blood. Henry created a surveillance state before the phrase even existed. Informants lined court hallways, spies whispered in taverns, bonds and recognizances, legal traps disguised as favors, kept the nobles obedient and the coffers full. Break a promise, pay a fortune, or worse. He ruled with caution, not charisma. But it worked. Yet danger came in the form of pretenders, like Lambert Simnel, a kitchen boy turned king, and Perkin Warbeck, a polished impostor claiming to be one of the lost princes in the Tower. Henry handled them both, one with mercy, one with execution. But the message was clear. Challenge the Tudors, and you'll end up in chains or stew. Let's talk about Perkin Warbeck. If there were an Olympic sport for lying with confidence, Warbeck would have taken gold. He claimed with suspiciously polished French to be Richard, Duke of York, the younger prince presumed murdered in the Tower by Richard III. Europe believed him, or pretended to. The Duchess of Burgundy, ever fond of making Henry's life difficult, embraced him as her nephew. James IV of Scotland backed him with troops. Even Margaret of York offered him courtly kisses and an army, which is more than some real kings got. But Henry VII? He didn't flinch. Warbeck's first invasion flopped so badly it made the English Channel look like a moat of truth. Still, he persisted, a charming ghost with borrowed armies. Henry captured him, paraded him, even gave him a role at court, a twisted game of keep your enemy close, until Warbeck tried to flee again. This time, Henry made it final. The pretender was hanged at Tyburn in 1499, a prince no more, if he ever was one. The death sent a message. The Tudors weren't playing dress-up anymore. They were here to stay, and they'd kill to prove it. When Henry VII died in 1509, England took a collective breath, not out of sorrow, but relief. And then came Henry VIII. 17 years old, tall, athletic, educated, and most importantly, male. England hadn't had a confident, strapping young king in decades, and Henry VIII fit the part like a well-cut doublet. He was everything his father wasn't: charismatic, generous, impulsive, a golden prince shining with promise. But beneath the pageantry was a restlessness. His court became a carnival of music, jousts, and flirtation. He loved deeply, feasted grandly, and spent extravagantly. His marriage to Catherine of Aragon, his brother's widow, was both strategic and romantic, at least at first. They were young, devout, and hopeful. But for Henry, hope wasn't enough. He wanted glory, the kind earned by kings in armor and sung by poets. He waged war against France, took minor victories, came home to fanfare, and basked in his popularity like a sun-drunk lion. This was not the scheming reign of a cautious spider. This was the roaring start of something very different. The age of Renaissance royalty had arrived, and it wore a Tudor rose. At first, Catherine was everything Henry admired: regal, composed, and popular. She gave him a daughter, Mary, and they ruled with grace. But time and fertility betrayed her. By the late 1520s, Henry had grown desperate for a son, desperate enough to convince himself that God had cursed the union, a biblical punishment for marrying his brother's wife. He sought an annulment. Enter Cardinal Thomas Wolsey. Wolsey, once a butcher's boy turned Lord Chancellor, was the power behind the throne. Clever, ruthless, and draped in velvet, he had served Henry for years, but this was a task even he couldn't pull off. The Pope, then a prisoner of Charles V, Catherine's nephew, refused to grant the annulment. And just like that, Wolsey fell. He was stripped of power, died on the road to trial. Some say of illness, others say of heartbreak. Either way, his ambition buried him. In his place rose a lawyer named Thomas Cromwell, and a plan that would reshape the religious soul of England. Because Henry wasn't just going to get divorced. He was going to divorce the Pope. The Pope said no. So Henry said, "Fine, I'm Pope now." It was a theological mic drop unlike anything Europe had seen. With the help of Thomas Cromwell, Parliament, and a few conveniently rewritten laws, Henry VIII declared himself supreme head of the Church of England. No more Roman meddling. No more foreign priests telling an English king what to do with his marriage bed. This was not just about lust. It was about legacy. Anne Boleyn, the woman who sparked this revolution, was sharp, cultured, and unapologetically ambitious. She gave Henry the passion he craved and the promise of sons. In 1533, they married in secret. Months later, she was crowned queen in a ceremony dripping with symbolism and scandal. Catherine of Aragon was banished. Her daughter Mary declared illegitimate. The monasteries trembled. The Pope fumed. And Europe held its breath. But Anne's victory was fragile. She gave birth not to a prince but to a girl, Elizabeth. And suddenly the same winds that had lifted her up began to shift. Henry wanted more than love. He wanted a male heir. And England was about to learn just how deadly that need could be. Anne Boleyn was no meek consort. She sparred with bishops, flirted with poets, and made enemies faster than a courtier could kneel. Her household buzzed with reformist ideas. Her charm? Electric. Her influence? Dangerous. But her womb betrayed her. After several miscarriages, including one rumored to be a boy, Henry grew cold. Anne's sharp tongue and Protestant leanings, once exciting, now grated. Whispers began. Affairs. Incest. Treason. Enter Thomas Cromwell. The same man who helped crown Anne now orchestrated her downfall. Some say it was political, others personal. Anne had threatened Cromwell's power, and he struck first. In May 1536, she was arrested, accused of adultery with multiple men, including her own brother George. She faced a trial both theatrical and predetermined. The evidence was weak. The outcome was not. On May 19th, she climbed the scaffold at the Tower of London. She wore a grey damask gown. Her final words were dignified, almost gentle. A French swordsman, brought specially to ensure a clean execution, ended her life with a single stroke. Anne Boleyn was dead, but her daughter Elizabeth still breathed. And history was not done with either of them. After Anne's death, Henry married Jane Seymour. Sweet, submissive, and politically neutral, the perfect antidote to Anne's wildfire. And she did what no other wife had done. She gave Henry a son. Prince Edward was born in October 1537. Jane died shortly after from postnatal complications. Henry mourned her genuinely. She remained in his words his true wife, perhaps because she never lived long enough to disappoint him. But Henry changed. The athletic, vibrant king became swollen, ulcered, and angry. A jousting accident left him with a leg wound that never fully healed. His temper, once manageable, turned volcanic. Courtiers lived in fear. Nobles vanished. Old friends became traitors by breakfast. He married again. Anne of Cleves, a German princess chosen by portrait. The reality? Henry thought she looked like a Flanders mare. The marriage was annulled in months. Then came Catherine Howard, barely in her teens, vivacious and flirtatious, and soon unfaithful. She was executed in 1542. The court whispered of her screams. Henry didn't care. Blood had become the cost of companionship. Catherine Parr was Henry's sixth and final wife. And she knew how to survive. Smart, diplomatic, and widowed twice already, she was more nurse than queen. She tended Henry's ulcers, managed his children, and dodged political traps with the grace of a seasoned courtier. She also believed in religious reform, quietly. Too quietly for some. Conservative factions at court tried to have her arrested for heresy. But Catherine played the part. She knelt. She apologized. She flattered. Henry spared her. In the end, it wasn't poison or politics that killed the king, but time. By 1547, Henry VIII was dying. His once mighty body had rotted from within. He couldn't walk, could barely speak, but he still ruled. On his deathbed, he named Edward, his 9-year-old son, heir. He left a regency council. He whispered prayers. Then the lion closed his eyes. The king who had broken a church, beheaded queens, and burned heretics, was gone. But the fires he lit? They were still burning. Edward VI inherited a kingdom built on broken vows and shattered altars. At just 9 years old, he was more symbol than sovereign. The real power fell to the Lord Protector, his uncle, Edward Seymour, Duke of Somerset. Somerset pushed England further toward Protestantism. Latin was stripped from churches, icons smashed, mass rewritten, monasteries repurposed into estates for the wealthy. But beneath the reforms was chaos. The economy crumbled. Uprisings flared, like Kett's rebellion in Norfolk. The people wanted food, not theology. Meanwhile, nobles schemed like it was a national sport. Somerset was eventually replaced by John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, slick, shrewd, and ruthless. Edward, though young, shared the zeal of a true reformer. He studied scripture, wrote treatises. He wanted England to be godly and strictly Protestant. But in 1553, he fell ill. Tuberculosis, the sweating sickness, or just Tudor bad luck. Whatever it was, it ate him quickly. Edward died at 15. And with him, the Protestant dream, for now. Because next in line was his Catholic sister, Mary, and she came with fire. When Edward died in 1553, the Protestant lords panicked. Edward had tried to bypass Mary in favor of Lady Jane Grey, his cousin and a Protestant. She was crowned in a quiet, rushed ceremony. But Mary wasn't having it. She was the daughter of Catherine of Aragon. She had survived exile, humiliation, and the execution of her mother's supporters. When news of Edward's death spread, Mary gathered allies. The people, weary of the manipulations of noblemen, rallied behind her. Jane's reign lasted 9 days. Mary entered London in triumph. Bells rang, crowds cheered. The true Tudor heir had returned. Jane was imprisoned in the Tower, a pawn who would pay with her life. Mary was the first woman crowned as queen in her own right. She did not intend to be the last. Mary's return to power was personal and theological. She intended to reverse the Protestant reforms of her father and brother. Mass was restored. Bishops reinstated. England was once more Catholic. But Mary also needed an heir. She was in her late 30s and unmarried. She chose Philip of Spain, son of Emperor Charles V. It was a political marriage, meant to forge an alliance with the greatest Catholic power in Europe. England, however, was less than thrilled. The people feared foreign rule. Parliament resisted. Uprisings broke out, most notably Wyatt's rebellion, which was crushed, but not without consequence. Mary married Philip in 1554. He was cold, distant, and gone most of the time. But Mary believed God would reward her with a son. She felt her belly swell. The court whispered of a pregnancy. But the months passed, and no child came. The disappointment of a phantom pregnancy hardened Mary's resolve. If she couldn't give England a Catholic heir, she would give it a Catholic soul. And so began the Marian persecutions. Protestants who refused to recant were burned at the stake. Over 280 men and women, including bishops, farmers, and former friends, were reduced to ash. Among them were Hugh Latimer and Nicholas Ridley, who died together in Oxford, their flames lighting the sky. "Be of good comfort, Master Ridley," Latimer said, "for we shall this day light such a candle by God's grace in England as I trust shall never be put out." And it wasn't. The burnings earned Mary the name that would haunt her legacy, Bloody Mary. She believed she was saving souls. History believed she was damning her reputation. Mary's reign unraveled quickly. Philip left. Rebellion simmered. The country was broke. Even loyal Catholics questioned her harshness. Her second supposed pregnancy also proved false, likely a tumor. Hope died quietly, as did her dreams of a restored Catholic dynasty. She named Elizabeth, her Protestant half-sister, as her successor. Whether it was out of resignation, obligation, or divine irony, we'll never know. On November 17, 1558, Mary died. She was 42. Her final years had been marked by loneliness, illness, and ghosts of children she never had, and flames she couldn't extinguish. Mary Tudor was buried in Westminster Abbey. Years later, Elizabeth would be buried above her. On the marble tomb, partners in throne and grave. History has not always been kind to Mary, but it never forgot her. When Elizabeth Tudor rose to the throne in 1558, the air itself seemed to change. She was 25, red-haired, unmarried, educated in 6 languages and trained in the art of survival. She had lived through scandal, imprisonment, and the executions of those she loved. She had learned when to speak and when to stay silent. Now, she was queen. Her coronation was a spectacle of calculated hope. The streets of London overflowed with cheering crowds. Pageants declared her the new Deborah, the Virgin Queen, the nation's savior. But the throne she inherited was cracked. The treasury was empty. The kingdom was divided. Enemies circled like sharks. Elizabeth, however, was not afraid. She surrounded herself with capable men: William Cecil, Robert Dudley, Francis Walsingham. She walked the line between Protestant and Catholic sympathies. She played foreign suitors like a virtuoso. And she gave one rule to her council: "I will have but one mistress and no master." England had entered the age of Gloriana. And the game was only beginning. Elizabeth's decision to remain unmarried wasn't just personal, it was political dynamite. Every monarch was expected to marry, especially a queen, especially a young one. But Elizabeth had watched her father's marital disasters. She had watched her mother die, her stepmother's fall, her sister marry a foreign king, and lose England's love in the process. She had learned marriage was risk. Instead, Elizabeth made herself marriageable, but never married. She entertained suitors from France, Spain, Austria. She kept them all guessing. She flirted in diplomacy like a MasterCard sharp, making her court a glittering dance floor of possibility and deception. Robert Dudley, the Queen's master of the horse, was her favorite. Some whispered he was more than that. His wife's mysterious death only deepened the gossip. But Elizabeth never married him. Or anyone. She said she was wedded to England. And for decades, she kept that vow. A woman ruling alone, in a world built by and for men, Elizabeth was no one's wife. She was the queen. Religious division was England's open wound, and Elizabeth had to stitch it fast. Catholics hoped she'd restore Rome. Protestants demanded stricter reform. Europe watched like vultures circling a wounded deer. Elizabeth, pragmatic as ever, created the Elizabethan religious settlement. The Church of England remained Protestant, but with a touch of Catholic flair. Latin hymns gave way to English prayers. Priests could marry, but vestments remained ornate, and cathedrals echoed with compromise. The Pope excommunicated her in 1570, declared her a heretic, encouraged assassination. Catholic plots flourished, some real, some imagined. But Elizabeth held her ground. "I do not want to make windows into men's souls," she famously said. She wouldn't police your conscience, just your loyalty. It wasn't peace, but it was stability. And that, in Tudor England, was rare currency. If Elizabeth was fire and steel, Mary Stuart was velvet and storm. Mary, Queen of Scots, Elizabeth's cousin had a better claim to the English throne in the eyes of many Catholics. She was elegant, charismatic, and reckless. After scandal and rebellion forced her to flee Scotland, she sought refuge in England. Elizabeth gave her custody. For 19 years. Mary was kept under lock and velvet cushion, moving from castle to castle. She wrote letters, schemed, prayed, plotted. To some, she was a martyr. To others, a threat. And then came the Babington plot, a conspiracy to assassinate Elizabeth and place Mary on the throne. The evidence, including coded letters, was damning. Elizabeth agonized. Executing a fellow queen was unthinkable. But in 1587, after pressure, persuasion, and her own counsel pushing the matter forward, Mary was beheaded at Fotheringhay Castle. It was done. But Elizabeth never forgave herself. She had killed a queen, and a mirror version of herself. The execution of Mary, Queen of Scots, enraged Spain. Philip II, once Elizabeth's suitor, and now her greatest enemy, launched the Spanish Armada in 1588, a massive fleet of ships carrying soldiers, cannons, and God's judgment. It was not just war, it was a holy crusade. England, outnumbered and outgunned, braced for annihilation. But fate and weather had other plans. The English Navy, led by seasoned commanders like Sir Francis Drake and Lord Howard, used smaller, faster ships to outmaneuver the lumbering Spanish galleons. Fire ships scattered the fleet. Storms battered it on the return voyage. Half the Armada never made it home. Elizabeth appeared before her troops at Tilbury, clad in armor, declaring, "I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king, and a king of England too." She won more than a battle. She won legend. After the Armada, Elizabeth became more than a monarch. She became an idea. Gloriana, the Virgin Queen. Astrea returned. Poets exalted her. Painters flattered her. Her image, all pearls, pale skin, and controlled majesty, became a national icon. But behind the mask of marble, time crept in. Her trusted advisors died one by one. Dudley, Walsingham, Cecil. Her court grew younger, more ambitious, less reverent, and Elizabeth, aging, alone, grew more withdrawn. She still danced, still commanded, still ruled. But the mask was slipping. Her final favorite was Robert Devereux, Earl of Essex, dashing, arrogant, doomed. After a failed rebellion, she had him executed. The pain of signing his death warrant haunted her. In the end, she ruled longer than any monarch before her. But ruling meant outliving nearly everyone she loved. Robert Devereux, Earl of Essex, was everything Elizabeth had once loved in a courtier: young, brave, poetic, and infuriating. He rose quickly, riding on the Queen's affection and his own boldness. He led military campaigns in Ireland, though poorly. He argued with the Queen in public. He burst into her chambers uninvited, once finding her wigless and furious. Elizabeth tolerated much. Until Essex staged a rebellion in 1601, trying to seize power with a handful of discontented nobles. It was clumsy, desperate, and quickly crushed. Essex was arrested, tried, and sentenced. On the eve of his execution, he begged for mercy. Elizabeth, torn and silent, finally signed the warrant. The man she once adored lost his head on Tower Green. She withdrew from court for weeks. It was not just the end of Essex. It was the beginning of the end for her. In her later years, Elizabeth became a ghost in her own palace. Gone were the endless progresses, the dances, the sharp wit that once left ambassadors stammering. The court dimmed. Her ladies reported her standing in silent corridors, staring at shadows. She refused to sleep, fearing she would not wake. Her gowns no longer dazzled. They hung like armor. Her fingers, once adorned with rings, now trembled. She sat upon cushions, refusing to be moved. And yet she would not name a successor. It was a dangerous silence, one that risked civil war. But Elizabeth had always believed that naming an heir was an invitation to plot her death. Eventually, she grew too weak to speak. In March 1603, she passed into unconsciousness. Her council gathered. In those final hours, she reportedly gestured toward James of Scotland, son of Mary, Queen of Scots. She died days later, at the age of 69. Unmarried, unchallenged, unforgettable, Elizabeth I's death in 1603 ended not just her reign, but the Tudor dynasty itself. No direct heirs, no siblings remaining, just a crown, a kingdom, and a legacy to hand over. James VI of Scotland was summoned. He rode south through cheering crowds, becoming James I of England. The union of the crowns was born. But something else faded that spring. The world of towering ruffs, swordplay, court masks, and whispered plots under candlelight, it passed into legend. The Tudors had ruled for just over a century. And in that century, they transformed England from a fractured medieval realm into a powerful centralized kingdom with a navy, a church of its own, and a queen who ruled like a king. It had begun on a battlefield with Henry VII. And ended with a single woman, alone on a cushion, facing the end without fear. The Tudors were gone, but their ghosts remained. What did the Tudors leave behind? More than just palaces and portraits. They left a church, born of politics, yet woven into national identity. They left a tradition of monarchy that was powerful, theatrical, and personal. They left cautionary tales of overreach, paranoia, and the cost of ambition. But they also gave England pride, sovereignty. The English Renaissance flourished under them. Shakespeare wrote under Elizabeth's gaze. The navy they built would one day rule the seas. And they left myths. Of kings with 6 wives. Of queens who burned and bled for faith. Of a red-haired woman who turned solitude into statecraft. The Tudors were never quiet. Never safe. Never small. They ruled like the world was watching. Because it was. Look closely, and you'll see the Tudors aren't gone. They live in every royal pageant, every coronation robe, every debate about church and crown. They whisper from the walls of Hampton Court and the stones of the Tower. They remind us that power is rarely clean, that glory often demands a price. They show us that monarchy is more than inheritance. It's performance, strategy, theater. And the Tudors were master actors on the world's grandest stage. So next time you see a coin, a crown, or a film about Henry or Elizabeth, remember you're not just watching history. You're watching the echo of an era that never truly ended. Before there was a Tudor throne, there was Margaret Beaufort, and she didn't need a sword to win battles. Married at 12, a mother at 13, a widow soon after. Her only son Henry Tudor was born during the chaos of the Wars of the Roses. Margaret spent years in political limbo, navigating Yorkist courts with Lancastrian loyalties. She prayed, plotted, and maneuvered like a chess master behind veils and rosary beads. It was Margaret who negotiated Henry's marriage to Elizabeth of York. Margaret who raised funds, gathered allies, and worked quietly to place her son on the throne. Once Queen Mother, she ruled the household with steely precision. She signed her letters, Margaret R., the R not for Regina, but Richmond, her own title. But make no mistake, she governed like a queen. And in her piety, she carved out power few women ever held, founding colleges, commanding servants, guiding policy. Margaret Beaufort didn't just birth the Tudor dynasty. She built it. Not all power wore a crown. Some wore coifs, waited in galleries, and moved silently behind closed doors. Elizabeth of York, wife to Henry VII, played her part with quiet dignity, a balm to his suspicion, and the living symbol of reconciliation after civil war. Her presence soothed nobles and reinforced legitimacy. She bore children, smiled at ceremonies, and was mourned deeply when she died in childbirth in 1503. Catherine of Aragon ruled beside Henry VIII for decades, regent during war, victor at Flodden, and a model of faith and strength. She refused to surrender her crown even after divorce. Dying in exile, she wrote to Henry, calling him my most dear lord and husband. Anne of Cleves outlived all of Henry's wives. Divorced but respected, clever enough to accept survival over pride. She called herself the king's sister, and lived in comfort. These women were not just wives. They were diplomats, survivors, and witnesses. They stood beside, and often above, kings. Behind every royal portrait was a child told they were destined for greatness or ruin. Edward VI, pale and precocious, was taught to think like a godly ruler before he could ride a horse. He memorized scripture, wrote essays, yet he lived in a world of cold corridors and colder politics. He died before 16, leaving behind a will and a national crisis. Mary, I grew up adored, then cast aside. Her mother's humiliation haunted her. Her faith became her armor. She was kind to her servants, ruthless to her enemies. Her phantom pregnancies speak to a life filled with hope and hollow endings. Elizabeth I grew up in fear. Branded a bastard, imprisoned, questioned, she watched heads fall and learned that silence was safety. She turned those lessons into strength, ruling longer and more gloriously than any Tudor. Their childhoods were not golden. They were forged in fire. If the Tudor court was a stage, the Tower of London was its backstage, where the final acts played out. Princes disappeared here, queens wept here, nobles met their end on Tower Green, facing the axe or the sword. Anne Boleyn's ghost is said to walk its halls, head still held high. Lady Jane Grey, only 16, prayed before her execution. Thomas More, philosopher and saint, composed his final thoughts in a cell barely lit. The Tower was not always a place of death. It was also a prison of waiting, of decisions, of final letters and whispered goodbyes. It held royal sons, disgraced favorites, accused wives. In Tudor England, a royal summons to the Tower was not a request. It was often a sentence. Beneath Elizabeth's glittering court lay something darker, a world of espionage. And its master was Sir Francis Walsingham, the Queen's spy master. Calm, devout, and coldly efficient, Walsingham built a network of agents across Europe. He cracked codes, intercepted letters, discovered plots before they ignited. His methods were ruthless, and his enemies many. The Babington plot, which led to Mary Queen of Scots' execution, was cracked by his intelligence team. Every letter, every cipher, every seal was analyzed. Elizabeth hated spies in theory, but trusted Walsingham completely. He wasn't a soldier. He was a shadow. And in the deadly world of Tudor politics, shadows often killed more surely than swords. The Tudors ruled with majesty, but not alone. Behind every royal decree stood the Privy Council, a hand-picked group of nobles, clerics, and bureaucrats who shaped policy, whispered in ears, and sometimes pulled strings. Under Henry VIII, the council was vast and chaotic, filled with factions and rivalries. Thomas More, Thomas Cromwell, the Seymours, all rose and fell by its drama. Elizabeth's council, however, was lean and lethal. She trusted few, especially William Cecil, later Lord Burghley, whose advice was cautious, calculated, and usually correct. He served her for 40 years, practically a second monarch in quill and ink. Robert Dudley brought charisma. Francis Walsingham brought surveillance. Later, Robert Cecil, William's son, would steer the twilight years. But even trusted men lived in fear. A wrong move could mean disgrace, or the Tower. In Tudor politics, no one stood beside the throne for long without watching their back. While kings played power games, something quieter, but just as revolutionary, was unfolding. Commerce. Tudor England saw the rise of the merchant class, men who owned no land, bore no title, but grew rich from trade, cloth, spices, and ambition. The wool trade fueled fortunes. Ports like Bristol and London became centers of import and export. Merchant guilds formed part economic muscle, part political influence. Some merchants became aldermen, mayors, even knights. Their daughters married into nobility. Their homes rivaled manors in splendor. They paid taxes, funded expeditions, sponsored theaters. And they brought change. No longer was power rooted only in birth. It could be bought, earned with ledgers and cargo ships. The Tudors ruled a kingdom, but merchants built the empire. Clothing wasn't just fashion in Tudor England, it was identity. Rank, power, sumptuary laws dictated who could wear what. Fur was for the elite, silks for the noble, gold thread, don't even think about it unless you had a title. For women, gowns were layered and stiffened. Bodices pinched the waist, sleeves puffed like swans. Ruffs, those iconic collars, grew so large they needed wire supports. Men wore doublets, hose, and cloaks. Codpieces, exaggerated, sometimes absurd. Colors were political. Elizabeth wore white and black, symbols of purity and power. Henry VIII favored reds and golds, projecting heat and wealth. Armor was ornate, more parade than protection, etched with lions, roses, even scripture. But behind the velvet and jewels was discomfort. Garments could weigh 40 pounds, corsets bruised ribs, and bathing was rare enough that perfume was considered strategic. In Tudor fashion, beauty came second. Status came first. Gutenberg's invention reached England in the late 1400s, just in time for the Tudors to weaponize it. Printing changed everything. Books no longer needed monks and decades. Pamphlets, sermons, poems, and polemics flowed faster than ever. William Caxton, England's first printer, helped standardize English. By the time of Henry VIII, presses printed everything from royal decrees to bawdy ballads. The Bible in English, once forbidden, became a symbol of reform. Tyndale's translations circulated underground. Eventually, with royal approval, the Great Bible was chained to pulpits across the land. Elizabeth's government used pamphlets to shape public opinion about Spain, the Armada, even traitors. And the people? They read, they learned, they questioned. Literacy spread especially in towns. With it came ideas, dangerous ones. The printing press didn't just inform, it ignited. It's easy to think Tudor history belonged to monarchs. But listen closely and you'll hear other voices. A servant girl writing home about her mistress's secret pregnancy. A sailor scrawling a farewell before sailing to the New World. A farmer's son composing a will, signing it with a trembling X. Records survive, wills, court testimonies, love letters, complaints. They speak of mundane things, a stolen pig, a broken cart, an unpaid debt, but also of heartbreak, dreams, and fear. Midwives left notes on difficult births. Apprentices kept tally of abuses. Prisoners scratched prayers into stone. These voices are faint, but they matter. Because history isn't just kings and queens. It's breath and bread. And the Tudors, like all of us, lived their lives one uncertain heartbeat at a time. Some ghosts never leave. Of all Henry VIII's queens, Anne Boleyn lingers the loudest, not just in legend, but in lore. Her story became myth, the ambitious enchantress, the mother of Elizabeth, the woman who changed the world and lost her head. But who was she? Anne was a patron of reformers, a reader of forbidden texts, a woman who refused to be mistress when she could be queen. She spoke her mind, she made enemies, she bore a daughter, not a son, and history punished her for it. After her death, her memory twisted, from witch, to martyr, to feminist icon. Each age reimagined Anne. But the truth is this. She was brilliant, flawed, dangerous, and she gave England one of its greatest rulers. That's not haunting. That's power. The Tudors didn't just rule, they built. Hampton Court Palace, once Cardinal Wolsey's, became a royal jewel. Whitehall, now vanished, stretched so far it needed maps. The Tudor style, with its red brick, grand chimneys and timber frames, redefined English domestic life. These were not just homes. They were symbols. Power expressed in stone and glass. Gardens sculpted to reflect royal order. Great halls where nobles knelt, and courtiers whispered behind goblets. Even the smaller manor houses adopted the style, ivy creeping up brick walls, wooden beams exposed in defiant display. These buildings didn't just shelter the powerful, they announced them. And centuries later, their shadows still fall, long across the English countryside. Elizabeth I was not just a queen, she became a religion. In her final decades, Elizabeth cultivated the image of the Virgin Queen, untouched, eternal, draped in pearls and divine symbolism. Portraits portrayed her with suns behind her head. Poets called her Gloriana, Astrea, even Fairy Queen. But it wasn't vanity. It was strategy. With no husband, no children, and no co-ruler, she was the state. She built a cult of personality centuries before the phrase existed. The people loved her, or feared her, or both. But when she died, something profound happened. The mass cracked. Mourners lined the streets, plays went dark, bells tolled, and even hardened courtiers wept openly. They weren't just grieving a monarch. They were grieving the end of an age. It's tempting to ask, what if? What if Edward VI had lived longer? Would Protestantism have become even more entrenched? What if Mary I had borne a son? Would England have remained Catholic? What if Elizabeth had married? Would there have been a Tudor dynasty beyond her? The truth is, we'll never know. But the fact that so many still wonder speaks volumes. The Tudors were lightning in a bottle, ambition, romance, blood, and brilliance caught in the chaos of history. They redefined monarchy, reshaped religion, and wrote their names in fire. And even their endings feel like cliffhangers. because the story never really ends. It only echoes. So here we are, 50 nights deep into blood, crowns, betrayal, and beauty. The Tudors began as exiles, rose through war, ruled through terror, charm, and sheer will. They killed for power, died for faith, and carved an England no one had imagined before them. They were not saints. They were not monsters. They were people, complex, cunning, fragile, who lived on the edge of greatness and ruin. And though their bloodline ended in 1603, their story never faded. They became literature, theater, Netflix, nighttime YouTube tales. They became myth. So next time you pass a portrait of a pale-faced queen, or hear a tale of 6 wives, remember, this wasn't just history. It was a dynasty of drama, a house of fire, a crown forged in ambition. And now, dear viewers, our journey through the Tudors ends here. But the past? It never sleeps. Good night, and thank you for watching Night Owl Historian. He began as a blacksmith's son. He died a nobleman. Thomas Cromwell rose like no one else in Tudor England, not by blood, but by brilliance. He served Cardinal Wolsey, learned from his fall, then became Henry VIII's right hand. Clever, pragmatic, and unshakably loyal to the king's cause, Cromwell masterminded the break from Rome. He dissolved the monasteries, redirecting their immense wealth to the crown and to favored nobles. He filled Henry's coffers, built alliances, crushed opponents. But even the most useful servant can fall. His downfall came after arranging Henry's marriage to Anne of Cleves, a political alliance that turned into a royal embarrassment. Henry never forgave the match, and Cromwell's enemies, long waiting, pounced. In 1540, Cromwell was arrested during a council meeting. No trial, no defense. He was executed days later. The man who had reshaped England's church died by the same system he had helped create. We've told their stories, now let's lay them side by side. Catherine of Aragon, married over 20 years, beloved by the people, cast aside without mercy. Anne Boleyn, the spark of Reformation, queen of 3 years, beheaded. Jane Seymour, died after childbirth, mourned by Henry above all others. Anne of Cleves, annulled, outlived them all, clever in retreat. Catherine Howard, barely out of girlhood, betrayed by her past, executed. Catherine Parr, widow, scholar, survivor. 6 queens. 2 beheaded. 1 died in childbirth. 1 divorced. 2 survived. They weren't just wives, they were pawns, players, mothers, reformers. Some loved Henry. None were safe from him. Their fates are not just cautionary tales. They're a testament to how power, even royal, does not protect against pain. No Tudor story is complete without a shadow from the past, the princes in the Tower. Edward V and Richard of Shrewsbury, sons of Edward IV, vanished in 1483 after being lodged in the Tower of London by their uncle Richard, Duke of Gloucester. They were never seen again. Historians still debate, were they murdered? By Richard III? By the Tudors? By someone else? When Perkin Warbeck claimed to be Richard, Duke of York, years later, many believed him, not just because they hated Henry VII, but because the truth had been buried under layers of fear. Bones were found in 1674 beneath a staircase in the Tower. Are they the princes? No one knows for sure. What we do know is this: their disappearance haunted the Tudors, especially Henry VII, who built his legitimacy atop their absence. In Tudor England, Parliament wasn't a powerhouse, but it was a useful tool. Henry VIII used it to rubber stamp his religious reforms, his divorces, and the creation of his new Church of England. Laws were passed declaring Anne Boleyn's children legitimate, then illegitimate, the same for Mary and Elizabeth. Legislation was less about debate and more about confirming royal will. But a change began to brew. By Elizabeth's reign, Parliament had begun to flex its voice, especially over issues like taxation and succession. They couldn't overrule the Queen, but they could delay, debate, and irritate. The seeds of modern government were planted under the Tudors. They didn't grow a democracy, but they cracked the idea that monarchy was absolute. To be seen at the Tudor court was everything. But to be entertaining, that was survival. The Tudors used pageantry not just for joy, but for propaganda. Banquets dazzled with sugar sculptures and entire peacocks roasted with their feathers reattached. Masks, elaborate, allegorical performances were staged for the monarch, filled with symbolism, flattery, and costumed nobility. Elizabeth particularly loved masks. They allowed courtiers to speak in metaphor, to critique and praise in the same breath. She played her part too, dancing, laughing, rewarding wit. But behind the sparkle was strategy. Every costume, every line, every guest list. It was all calculated. Because the Tudor court was theater, and survival required a brilliant performance. For every crowned head in a palace, there were 1,000 lives in the fields. Tudor England was not all velvet and gold. For most it was mud, sweat, and survival. The average person lived in a one-room cottage, worked dawn to dusk, and rarely traveled more than a few miles from home. They brewed their own ale, made their own clothes, and rarely bathed, but that was practical, not preference. The diet? Bread, pottage, and whatever meat could be caught or afforded. Nobles feasted on venison and sweets. Peasants boiled cabbage and hoped for an egg. Religion was central. The church calendar dictated the rhythm of the year. Fasts, feasts, saints' days. Education was rare, unless you were male and noble. Even then, most knowledge came through the Bible, the law, or practical skills. Yet, through plague, taxes, and tyranny, the people endured. History remembers the monarchs. But the Tudors stood on the backs of those who toiled unseen. While Henry VIII fought popes and Elizabeth dodged assassins, another drama was unfolding across the sea. The age of exploration had arrived. Spain and Portugal were already dividing the globe. The Tudors, slower to start, soon joined the race. Sailors like John Cabot attempted voyages under Henry VII. Later, Francis Drake, Walter Raleigh, and Martin Frobisher set out under Elizabeth's banner. Pirates to some, heroes to others. Drake circumnavigated the globe. Raleigh dreamed of colonies in Virginia, named for the Virgin Queen. The Roanoke colony, one of the earliest English attempts, vanished mysteriously, leaving behind only a carved word, Croatoan. These expeditions weren't just adventurous. They were lucrative and brutal. Slavery, conquest, and exploitation followed the sails. Gold and sugar flowed in, along with disease and war. The Tudors opened the door to empire. The cost would be paid for centuries. The glories of Tudor England were often accompanied by the stench of disease. The sweating sickness struck fast and killed faster. Victims dropped within hours. Bubonic plague resurfaced in waves. Typhus, smallpox, and childbirth claimed countless lives. Medicine was equal parts superstition and leeches. Physicians relied on humors, blood, phlegm, black and yellow bile to explain everything from fevers to melancholy. Cures included bloodletting, herbal brews, astrology, and in some cases prayer mixed with pigeon dung. Rich patients could afford doctors. Poorer souls relied on wise women, midwives, and local healers, many of whom knew more than the professionals. But despite the horror, there were advancements. Hospitals grew. Anatomy became science. Even Henry VIII founded royal medical colleges. Illness reminded Tudor England of its frailty. And every monarch ruled beneath the shadow of a plague cart. Tudor justice was swift and often theatrical. Steal a loaf of bread? Risk a whipping or branding. Murder? Hang. Treason? Expect something slower, like being drawn, hanged, and quartered. Punishment was public, meant to deter and humiliate. Stocks in the village square. Execution scaffolds at Tyburn. Heads on spikes atop London Bridge. Even minor crimes could carry weight. Gossip, adultery, or skipping church. Fines, public shaming, or worse. But not all was cruel spectacle. Justices of the peace handled local disputes. Law was written down and standardized more than in previous centuries. Still, wealth played a role. Nobles could often avoid punishment unless they angered the crown. Then, even a duke could meet the axe. In Tudor England, justice wore many faces. And none of them smiled. Behind every royal decree and council meeting lurked something older. Belief? Tudor England was deeply superstitious. People feared witches, omens, and portents. A black cat crossing your path? Trouble. A woman with a mole on her lip? Possibly in league with Satan. Illness was sometimes blamed on sin. Storms on sorcery. Queen Elizabeth owned an official astrologer, John Dee, who advised her using stars and mysterious mirrors. He called himself a seer. Others whispered wizard. Everyday folk carried charms to protect crops, wore herbs to repel evil, and believed dreams might foretell death. Witchcraft trials were fewer than in later centuries, but fear brewed. Magic and religion blurred lines. Saints' relics sat beside charms. Holy water sprinkled next to hagstones. Science was rising, but belief held strong. Because in Tudor England, the veil between heaven and hell always felt thin.